Okay, well, in the interest of time, because I know we've got an hour and a fair bit to fit in, I think we'll get started and we'll pick up anyone as we go. You've all obviously joined us for a very exciting session today. We are here with a published author that we will hear a little bit more about from Ela in a moment. I think the slide on screen perfectly summarizes what we're here to do today. So my name is Tom Hughes. I'm a senior underwriting and claims executive at the RUA. If you haven't come across the RUA before, we are the trade association that represents the company market in London. So it's the international and wholesale insurers and reinsurers that are operating in that half of the market, broadly half of the market that sits alongside Lloyd's in London. Now, I am here as part of this session, but I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ela Metalia, who works across all of our casualty committees. Ela is an underwriting and claims executive at the RUA and will give us a little bit more of an idea about the session, about the speaker, and then we'll hand over and we'll get started. So I hope you'll enjoy the session. Ela.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's online today and joined us for the Sliptember event. So I'll be introducing our lovely speaker, Christian Harris, who's recognised as a leading authority in slip safety. As a founder of Slip Safety Services, he's used an innovative, data-driven approach to support thousands of clients over the last 12 years, reducing their slip accidents, injuries, and claims by 57%, approximately. Christian is also the host of the Safety and Risk Success podcast and regularly speaks at conferences and events around the world, including this event today. And as Tom has mentioned, he's also recently published a book called Prevent Slip Accidents with Slipology, which has been released in the last week or so, and we highly recommend getting a copy. And the session specifically today will be looking at how insurers can protect their loss ratios, add value to clients, and keep more people safe, all in relation to slip safety. I will now hand over to Christian to get started with the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here today. Ela mentioned the word Sliptember. That's just a little play on words that I created about 4 or 5 years ago to try and raise awareness about what you can do to stop slip accidents, injuries, and claims every September. So thank you for joining me on this session today. What we're going to talk about is firstly a bit of framing. So why is slips a big challenge for insurers? Then what can we do about it with a slightly different mindset? So I'm going to challenge your thinking and challenge your way of dealing with this issue at the moment. And then I'm going to give you some specific examples of what can be done using a more data-led scientific approach and some of the successes we've had in that field. And that will give you a flavour for actually, if you can sort of dig a little bit deeper on this, then there are some exciting outcomes that you can achieve. Just to start with, I'll give you my quick backstory as to why I am involved in this field, because it's obviously quite a niche area. So I developed a passion for safety through an incident that happened to me. So if you cast yourself back to 2012, just before the Olympics, I live in London now, and I lived in London then. This was a time before marriage and kids, so Sundays were relaxing. My wife, who at the time was my girlfriend, and I went to Columbia Road Flower Market in East London, had some lunch, had a walk along the canal. We're having a jolly nice, relaxing Sunday. We then started heading home, and we drove to Islington, parked up our car in the Sainsbury's car park, and turned onto Tolpuddle Street to start to walk towards the front of the store. I was walking pretty much where this chap in this photograph is shown, walking towards the entrance of the store, and then that's the last thing that I remember for several hours. A car had sped around the corner, lost control, mounted the curb, and ploughed into me. So that's a picture of me later that evening, and you can see it was a few years ago because my hair is much darker than it is now. You can see I've broken my collarbone, I broke my wrist, I broke my ankle, kind of all my left-hand side was quite severely impacted. But obviously I always say, though I was unlucky that it happened to me, I was very lucky that it wasn't worse. So when something like that happens to you, you get a keen interest in safety, as you'd expect. And that's kind of what fueled my passion to work in this area. Quick bit about me, you've heard a bit already. I do a lot of content around safety and risk generally. So I have a podcast and LinkedIn newsletter, various other things. But I really niche down day to day in this field of slip safety. I've worked in some high profile cases. I'm going to speak about this co-op case a little bit later. And as mentioned, I've just released my book last week, which got to bestseller status in both the safety books and insurance books on Amazon, which was a real pleasure. The business is called Slip Safety Services. We've won some awards. We have some partnerships with people like AXA, some great clients like Network Rail, CBRE, and do lots and lots of talks. We've helped several thousand sites to reduce their slip risk. And we reckon at last count, we're stopping about £10 million a year of claims. So I got run over by a car. What led me to go into the world of slips? Well, I was a consultant by training. So I was used to analysing markets and looking at the data and figuring out what was going on and the trends and so on. And when I started looking into safety, I found that road safety we were doing pretty well in. But I became aware of this big category called slips, trips and falls. And you can see from this data set here, this is RIDDOR, which are reportable injuries to the HC. Not only is slips, trips and falls the biggest category, but it's also a very flat category. So, we weren't doing a very good job with it. The situation hadn't really improved and it was the biggest area. So I thought, well, if I'm going to work in safety, that sounds to me like a good place to start. I'll speak a bit more about this in a minute, but within the category of slips, trips and falls, the vast majority are slips, and slips is also much more scientific than trips. Secondly, slips has a massive impact. So there's a broken bone every 3 minutes. It's the leading cause of A&E admission, 1.5 million NHS bed days, and there's lots and lots of other data and statistics, which led me to think, yeah, this is a cause that is worth fighting for. But also, and critically of importance, it is possible to have a big effect and to dramatically reduce the volume of incidents, injuries and claims that occur as a result of slips. So it is possible to do something about it. So that status quo should not be accepted. So looking at the insurance market, a bit of data here from AXA. I actually checked, and this isn't any longer on their website, but it was on their website, claims data from 2018. They wrote an article about this. For AXA UK, slips alone are the costliest type of health and safety claims. So the data from 2018 was 80 million for slips for AXA UK. And then the next biggest was manual handling, which was 30 million. So slips are more than twice as big an issue as manual handling, just for AXA. And then trips is on top of that. If we take AXA and say, perhaps they've got 5% of the market, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, what percentage of the market they might have, but I suspect it's much less than 5%. But if you said it was 5% and we extrapolate that out, then that's saying that there's 1.5 billion of slip claims annually just in the UK. Obviously, if we go into other markets, the US, for example, the numbers in the US are magnified because of the slightly more favourable court and legal system there. So whereas in other countries, you normally find that it's roughly in line with population. But the picture is actually, if anything, getting worse. And there are some quite big macro drivers to this. Clearly, we've got demographics. So we have an aging population. The older you are, the more likely you are to fall, according to the data, and the more likely you are to be more seriously hurt. As the population gets older, people are working later in life. They're also being more active in their leisure time later in life, and therefore the exposure to this type of incident is growing. There's legislative stuff which is driving what's going on. Obviously, we need to think about inflation, especially the cost of healthcare from a claims cost perspective. If we've got an aging population, more and more of these things happening, and healthcare inflation is very high, that's driving costs up. And even the climate. So the Met Office recently said that they're expecting the UK to be much, much wetter, and obviously people slip when the weather is wet. So I mentioned this earlier. We need to, one piece of advice I'd always give is to drill down a little bit into the data, because we often categorize slips, trips, and falls as one and the same thing, and they're actually not. So if somebody has a problem with slipping in their business, then the strategies you would use to deal with trips are not going to work for them. So we need to figure out which they actually have as a problem. Here's a bit of claims data from the claims portal. And this illustrates the point I made earlier, that slips is a much, much bigger chunk of this than trips. So retail slips 20% of claims, trips 8%, manufacturing slips 38% of claims, trips only 3%. So one piece of advice I always give is to try to unbundle slips, trips, and falls from being in a single bucket, and see if you can encourage through your broking partners and down to the clients to try and capture this data in individual buckets of slips versus trips versus falls. And that's going to be really helpful to you in terms of how you can then approach the solution side of this. So that's a bit of scene setting. Now, why is it that we haven't solved this from an insurance perspective? I'll give you three examples or three reasons that I have sort of seen over the years. The first thing is that there are challenges around mindset and skill sets. And this is both within the insurance market, but also within the clients. The result of that is that there's almost this kind of acceptance that these are inevitable, they're bound to happen, there's nothing we can do about it, so therefore we just won't bother really doing much. And we end up with this kind of superficial approach and no real drive to try and improve. So therefore we get these volumes. And also that means that the defensibility evidence is pretty sparse, to say the least. The second driver, the second cause that it's a challenge for you guys in insurance, is that the traditional risk management model that you guys employ can't really cope with this problem because it's so thinly spread, and it's so endemic and so affecting of pretty much everybody. And you guys can't send a risk surveyor to every single site. So that kind of boots on the ground traditional risk management approach, it's very costly, obviously, to implement, and it's not scalable. So for slips, it doesn't really work. And then the other big challenge that I see is that we're very, very focused on claims defensibility. So we're looking after the horse has already bolted, or to use another analogy, you know, we're filling up this bathtub or this lake with water of claim after claim after claim, and we're trying to scoop out this big lake with a massive river flooding into it with a little bucket and spade. Being reactive has got us to the point where we are, where we've got a problem. We need to flip this on its head and be proactive. We need to be preventative. And there is a role for the insurance market to play in encouraging, supporting, potentially funding that kind of more proactive and preventative approach, rather than just doing, you know, another claims defensibility workshop, which we do a lot of, and really that isn't going to stop this problem. So if you think of it like a river, and the claims are flowing through, and at the top of the river is obviously an accident happening, and then something else happens that causes, you know, an injury happens, and then other steps are taken, and then this leads into a claim. What we need to do is to try and block up this river. So if you think about a reservoir analogy, if that river is flowing into a reservoir, and the reservoir is overflowing, and that's kind of like your loss ratio, overflowing and breaking the banks of the reservoir. If we could dam up some of that river and stem the flow coming into the reservoir, it's not going to fill up as much. We can also then plug in some irrigation and other things off the back end of this, and we can dissipate the water out of that reservoir at the back end too, through claims defensibility and things like that. But at the moment, we're just not doing enough to stem the tide of the river. So what we want to get to is a position where we have fewer claims, and improve defensibility, rather than what we typically do is we work on the defensibility piece. So when I speak to insurers about this, I speak about these kind of 5 principles, and I'm quite a big fan of having mnemonics or anagrams, or any sort of way of making something memorable. So these are down as 5 C's. These kind of principles are relevant to every risk, but I guess given the data I've shared, slips is the biggest, so it probably would make sense to start there. But you could use these principles to think about any type of risk that you were dealing with as well. So the first thing is about communication. So I think there's a role for insurers to be in a more partnership approach, and to be guiding, advising, influencing clients to do a better job. Clients are busy running their businesses. Actually, you're a trusted source. There's a financial benefit. There are lots of reasons why you can influence these people. So I think educating clients on why risk control matters and the benefits that they can get out of it is really, really important. There's the classic accident iceberg. The HSE says, for every £1 of insured cost, which is where you guys come in, there's 8 to 36 pounds of uninsured costs. People get very fixated on the £1 of insured cost, and they don't think about the uninsured costs. So I think there's a role here around better communication and influencing that you could play. In terms of the solutions bit, how can we be more preventative? Create is all about what can we do to make this risk management more scalable and more in-depth. So I like to speak about being inch wide, mile deep, rather than mile wide, inch deep. If you think about a health and safety professional, let's say, or a facilities manager, they fundamentally have to be a mile wide, because they have to know about everything that's going on, and therefore on average they're only going to be an inch deep. Whereas with what you guys can do, if you're focusing on different areas of risk, and what I do in my world is I go inch wide, mile deep. I really specialize in particular areas. And we're at the point now where technology like Zoom and like other things means we can do things more scalably, and that overcomes that challenge around the boots on the ground issue. Capture. So it's not only about prevention, it's also about evidencing. So we can, again, leveraging technology, really get away from the typical cleaning checklists and other things that don't really help us when it comes to claims defensibility, and actually start capturing both the inputs and the outputs, and giving us that certainty further up the stream that clients are doing what they need to do to prevent risk, to prevent incidents and mitigate risk, but also on the back end give us that more robust evidence to defend claims that do arise. Clarify. So this to me is, again, leveraging data, leveraging science. If you can work with, let's say, a book of business in the hospitality sector, and you can figure out a way to improve their claims experience and make that book of business more profitable, then rather than plugging in some historical data and putting pricing models together, we can plug in this new data where actually we've been able to implement stuff that's changed things, and that's going to give you some really interesting predictive analysis and ability to price risks a bit differently, and perhaps in more creative and interesting ways, that's going to enable you to win more business. And care. So the last sort of mindset shift will be to take this partnership approach, be more open, be more transparent, be more collaborative. Don't just be risk transfer, be a risk partner. Think about, for example, what it costs to bring in new business versus retain business. If you can be supportive and actually help clients to mitigate this risk, prevent these accidents, they will see the benefits. If you're the one that's brought them to that party, that is going to stand you in very good stead to build on that partnership. So if we can do all of that stuff, then what we should see, and this is what I've seen from clients that we've worked with, is fewer incidents and therefore fewer claims. If we're speaking about legitimate claims, if we've got 100 incidents versus 30 incidents, let's say, of course, the odd big one might come up because, you might have only one claim and it's a really expensive one. But from a volume perspective, and this is kind of a volume game because the numbers are so vast, we're going to be in a better position with having fewer claims coming through. And by capturing this evidence, capturing all this data, having a real handle on what we're doing and being able to prove what we've done upstream and downstream, we're going to be in a much better position to be able to defend claims as well. So I mentioned my book, and it's called Prevent Slip Accidents with Slipology. Slipology is a term that I've coined, which is all about how to marry up science and slips and take a more scientific approach. The book walks through these 5 steps, which is the Slipology model. The 5 steps are what businesses need to do, and this is where we're getting into more of the technical stuff now. Physically do to reduce and mitigate that risk. So you guys wouldn't be physically doing this stuff on behalf of the clients, but you could be encouraging, supporting, influencing, potentially part funding, or whatever, some of these steps. So it's assess, which is all about better, deeper understanding. Amend, which is reducing the risk, putting those risk controls in place. Advocate is about getting buy-in and driving that culture that means that these improvements stick. Assure is about an ongoing maintenance program and continuous improvement to keep those standards high. And Affirm is all about being able to prove and evidence what we've done. So that's the 5 steps that the book goes through and the 5 steps that we take clients through. For today, I'm just going to focus and talk a little bit about the first 2, which are the kind of foundational levels, and then a bit about the 5th section as well. But bear in mind, the book is 60,000 words, so I can't cover all of that in 15 minutes that I've got left, or whatever it is. So perhaps the biggest thing that people get wrong when it comes to slips from a client perspective is that they look at it too superficially. So they think, oh, if we just do this, or if we just do that, or it's pretty simple, let's just do this, then they feel they're solving the problem. And I'll give you an example in a minute. But the reality is there's a bit more breadth and depth to this problem. It's more scientific than people realize. So running throughout the 5 steps of Slipology is a concept that I call chimes. And the idea here is if you tune your chimes, you stop slips. So these are the 6 key reasons that people slip. If you were a health and safety audience, I'd go into a lot of detail about each of these, but I'm just going to give you a sense of how this works because you're not sort of technical health and safety people. But it's worth knowing this because it will just kind of illuminate your thinking a bit. And these are the areas where you should be asking questions. So if somebody's saying, here's this risk and they're really good because of X, Y, and Z, well, out of interest, what are they doing for contamination to manage slip risk? What's their maintenance regime? What information have they got about surface around slip risk? Just going that a little bit deeper would be really beneficial. So I'll run you through the 6 quickly. We've got contamination, which is all about what's on the floor. So if a floor is perfectly clean and dry, then it's not going to present a slip risk. But if there's some contamination, that's going to increase the likelihood. That could be water, grease, oil, dust, semi-solids, anything that produces a barrier between the foot and the floor is a kind of contaminant. Heel is footwear. So one of the things that people will often say is, oh, we have safety footwear, that's fine. There's a bit more to it than that. Just because you've got a safety shoe doesn't mean it's slip resistant, or it may be slip resistant in your kitchen, but if you've got the same shoe in your back of house area, or for your gardeners, or for your delivery drivers, it doesn't mean that will work to maintain slip resistance in those settings. And obviously members of the public, we can't control what they're wearing on their feet. Individual is the human factors. So I mentioned already there's a demographic piece to this. If you're an 80-year-old woman, you're statistically more likely to fall than if you're a 20-year-old man. You're also more likely to hurt yourself more seriously. Here we're thinking about activities that people do that can heighten the risk of a slip. So pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, carrying, rushing, being distracted. To what extent can we manage those behaviours in our buildings and therefore mitigate risk? M is for maintenance. This is about wear and tear, change of use, and cleaning. I'll give you an example about all three of those later, but they can all have a massive effect. And, you know, again, a misconception is, oh, we've got safe floors, we're okay. The devil is in the detail. E is environment. That is about obviously the weather. So, you know, Manchester versus Mauritius versus Madrid are all going to have different amounts of rainfall and humidity and so on and so forth. But it's also the built environment, entrance systems like entrance matting, lighting, noise levels, steps and stairs, ramps and slopes. All of these things play a role. And then S is surface, so the floor. And obviously some floors are more slippery than others, but often there are challenges about floors that perhaps, you know, are perceived as being slip resistant but aren't necessarily so. Now, across several thousand sites, we've enabled businesses to self-assess their chimes scores, and I'll explain how in a minute. And this is what we see as an average across sectors, predominantly in the UK, but some international as well. So on average, businesses are doing quite well with heel, with footwear. They're doing pretty well with maintenance, environment and contamination, and they've got most room to improve on individual and surface. So if I were called in to look at a business and this is the profile that they presented with, the first thing I'd do is I'd say, right, we need to figure out what we can do to improve our performance under individual and surface. And then once we've got to an equilibrium, I'd be then looking for a kind of continuous improvement over time. How have we got those scores? We have developed a free self-assessment tool, and we've used this, as I said, across different sectors. You could use this as well. This is an example of what I spoke about earlier about something that's digital and therefore scalable as a risk management tool. Basically, you get the general manager or whoever, health and safety manager or whoever it is in this building to spend about 3.5 minutes answering a few questions, and then they get a score overall plus a score for each of the chimes, and that helps them to understand, you know, to what extent they have a potential risk now, and also where they're strongest and where they've got room to improve. So we've done this across groups, for example, of hundreds of sites. You therefore then get the overall picture, but you can then sort of drill down into, you know, what are the best 10% doing and learn from that, and where are the worst performing 10% struggling, and therefore what can we do to be a bit more hands-on and proactive with them. So if you want to give that a go, it's scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk. I think we'll send out the link for that afterwards as well. So I mentioned it's all about science, and science is all about measurement. So what we need to start doing is trying to quantify in these 6 areas, and then we focus in on improving the metrics that we are monitoring. And these are all input metrics. You know, we should of course be tracking the number of incidents we're having, but it's not all about that, because we might just be lucky by not having incidents. Whereas actually, if we track the inputs, then we know we're on track. Think of it like sales. So if any of you have to sell anything, you can't control if somebody's going to buy from you or not. So you're not in control of the end result of being in sales. But what can you control? You can control how many times you pick up the phone, how many emails you send, what you send to people, how you build your profile on LinkedIn, how well designed your marketing materials are. So there's loads of stuff that are inputs that you can control. And if you get those inputs right, then you know that the end outcome should take care of itself. And it's similar with this. So the big one, I suppose, is slip testing. I'm going to show you what that is in a minute, but the benefit of slip testing is that we can measure 3 of the 6 chimes. And I always say that of the chimes, the surface is the most important, because if you think of it logically, let's say you're talking about a swimming pool. You know, you could have really good contamination control, but the floor is still going to get wet. You can't really control footwear in that setting. You can tell people not to rush and not to run, as we do. You can clean the floor pretty well. You can have good lighting, etc. But fundamentally, if you put a sheet of ice on the floor around a swimming pool, or a sheet of glass, or a shiny marble on the floor, that slippery floor means people are going to slip. So you can withstand a lot if you've got the floor right, but if you haven't got the floor right, you're not really giving yourself much chance. So in the UK, and it differs around the world, we use a machine to do slip testing called a pendulum test. It's what the HSE use. It's what lawyers use in court. So I do expert witness reports for court. What it does is it mimics a heel striking a floor. I'm going to show you a video in a second, and you'll see how that works. It gives you a number called a pendulum test value, or PTV. And one big advantage of this test is you can test any floor in situ. So this is what it looks like. So this guy's going to spray the floor with water. He's then going to release the foot of the pendulum, and it's called a pendulum because it swings. It's going to swing from right to left. And as it swings down, watch how the foot of the pendulum strikes the floor. And imagine somebody walking, and you'll be able to picture in your mind, okay, yeah, that makes sense how that heel is hitting the floor. As the pendulum swings through to the left, it pushes a pointer onto a gauge on the left-hand side of the machine. Don't worry about what the number means. I'll tell you that in a second. So spray the floor, release the foot, swing, and then you get the number on the left-hand side. Show it to you again. Spray the floor, swing. So I'm going to speak to you in a minute about a very serious incident, which was a death caused by a slip. As a result of that, HSE were called in. They did this testing. I was called in on behalf of the business. I did this testing. All this testing had to be presented to the court. It's all, you know, this is the proper way of doing this in the UK. So why would we slip test then? There's 2 kind of big benefits to it, really. One is to reduce the risk. So we get the number called the PTV, and there are 3 categories of slip potential: high, moderate, and low, depending on how you score. And then the HSE did a correlation some years ago about PTV, so in other words, how slippery the floor is versus the exposure to accident risk. And again, this illustrates the point that the floor is probably the key criteria here. If you're over on the right-hand side of the screen and you've got a score of 36, you're in the low slip potential category, and there's a 1 in 1 million accident risk exposure. Whereas if you move down to the left and you've got a PTV score of 24, you have a high slip potential, and you have a 1 in 20 accident risk exposure. That doesn't mean that 5% of people that walk over that floor will fall over, but it means that 5% of people walking over that floor in that condition may well fall over, or they might, for example, you know, I've never slipped and fallen over. I've slipped loads of times, but I've caught myself. You know, I've regained my balance. So you know, it's that kind of thing. So doing this testing, bringing this science in, enables us to figure out and map ourselves on this chart. You know, where are we? And obviously, if we're down towards the left, we can then figure out what we can do to mitigate the risk. So the slip testing helps us to quantify and give us a number, and you know, what gets measured gets managed. We can then reduce our risk. The other big benefit is around defensibility. So David Scott works for Keogh's, and you guys may well have heard of them, or they may be on your panel of lawyers. David looks after hospitality and leisure claims. We were talking on my podcast about a scenario where someone slips around a swimming pool and they hurt themselves, and their opinion would be, in David's words, that they're entitled to make a claim. And he said, no. Well, they're entitled to make a claim, but they're not going to win the claim, because the onus on you, again in the UK, is about taking the reasonably practicable steps to mitigate the risk. You're not expected to have an accident-free environment. And as David said, if you have compliant slip test data, you should expect to defend that claim. So if you can prove that your floor was safe even when it was wet, even though somebody slips, even though they legitimately hurt themselves, you should still expect to defend that claim. And that's the power of having the right kind of data that's current and accurate, versus what we often see, which is kind of flimsy, qualitative data to try and defend claims. I'm going to give you another few examples and things to think about here. And these are, again, you guys aren't health and safety practitioners, but these are things for you just to bear in mind and consider when you're thinking about slip, about risks, potential clients that have a slip exposure. So one of my bugbears is when I speak to, let's say, a group, and I ask to see their policies and procedures. Everyone has policies and procedures for slips, trips, and falls, but normally they're very short and they're very generic. And what they don't do, what they miss out on, is a key insight, which is that there are certain areas, certain settings in buildings that are much more prone to having slips than others. Perhaps it's 5%. I tend to say it's 5% across all sectors. Some sectors are more, some sectors are less. These are the settings, these are the environments that are constantly wet or otherwise contaminated. So the typical thing around in a slips, trips and falls policy is clean as you go, keep floors dry, deal with spillages. But that doesn't work in these areas. You can't say clean as you go, keep floors dry, deal with spillages in a kitchen or outside where it's raining, or around a swimming pool, or in a hotel bathroom, or in a washroom, or in a building entrance if you don't have enough entrance matting, for example. There are certain settings where they're foreseeably wet or foreseeably contaminated, and therefore those areas need to be safe when they're wet or contaminated. So that's things like, as I say, that list of examples I just gave. So these areas, they need to be safe in their intended use, which is being wet or contaminated, whereas the 95% is where we do the spillage control, good cleaning, clean as you go, etc., etc. And this is a big hole where people get this wrong. So just something I wanted to flag up. Entrance matting, right? So the next time you're walking through the city or you're going to a client's building, consider this data here in the top right. This is HC guidance. So if you have a peak traffic flow per hour of 800 people per hour, so think of a shopping centre, a train station, a busy office building in the city, a school, a hospital, you should have 8 to 10 meters of built-in matting. The picture on the left is from Birmingham New Street train station, and you can see they've got matting. That's about 3.5 meters of matting. But that entrance, I'm sure, would get more than 800 people per hour. And on a wet day, you can see that floor is wet beyond the matting. So people think, I've got matting, so therefore that's fine. But matting is only as good as how big it is and how effective it is. So I always say to people, stand inside on a wet day and see whether the matting is actually working. But if you start walking around high streets, cities, looking in the doors of buildings, what you'll see is most buildings have like maybe a meter of matting, and that's nowhere near enough. Cleaning, again, we outsource our cleaning, or we clean every day, but but there's a difference between clean and cleaning. An analogy would be, if you think about going to the gym, you could go to the gym and lift weights every day, but you wouldn't necessarily get bigger and stronger if you don't use the right technique and the right form, and you don't do the right recovery and so on and so forth. So there's a difference between the output of what we're trying to achieve and the input of trying to do something. So this floor, for example, looks pretty clean. It's in a shopping centre. It's only when you clean a tile you realise that, oh, hold on, it's actually consistently dirty. And the difference between a floor that's clean and dirty can be massive in terms of slip risk. Signage. So this is the co-op case that I mentioned. This is the CCTV footage. The man whose feet you can see at the top of the screen is called Stanley May. He's about to walk down the aisle, slip on that puddle of water, bang the back of his head and pass away. Now, most people, if I got rid of the text saying, what would you say if I told you that this man was about to die? And I said, what's wrong with this? They'd probably say, well, nothing, because the sign's out. But the sign didn't stop him slipping, didn't stop his injuries and sadly his death. And it didn't stop both the civil claim and a criminal prosecution. And Cornwall Council said signage alone is not an adequate control. Proactive measures must be taken to either prevent floors becoming slippery or precluding public access. So signs are symptoms of a problem. If you go into a building and there's a wet floor sign out, that means they know they've got a problem and they're not addressing it properly, unless they're physically cleaning the floor. So if they're doing their proactive, pre-planned cleaning, or if they're dealing very quickly with a spillage, then absolutely put a sign out. But other than that, the sign is just saying, we know we've got a problem and we're not addressing it correctly. And then lastly, floors that look safe versus that are safe. So this floor is a ramp in a hospital. It was chosen because it's a safe floor, right? It's checker plating. It's got a heavy texture on it. Must be anti-slip. Actually, when it was slip tested, it was really, really slippery. This floor here is in a manufacturing facility. I actually took this photo. I walked into this spice blending factory and I looked at the floor and I thought, oh, that's a good floor. And then we started looking more closely and we did some slip testing and we realized that the floor was about 12 or 15 years old. It looks like it should be anti-slip, but it's worn away. It's very smooth in the traffic areas, and therefore it doesn't perform as it looks like it should. And then here's an example of cleaning again. When we slip tested this floor, and the perception here from this leisure centre manager was my floor's safe, the floor had a 1 in 20 risk. When it was cleaned, it had less than 1 in a million risk. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour there in terms of where are we in the insurance world, how can we address that, and then some of the more specific things around slip safety and the science of it. What's in it for you? Why should you care? If you're on this call, you're probably writing some risks in casualty, and therefore you're going to have an exposure to this. What I would say is if you can take a more proactive, scientific, preventative approach, straight away, you'll be able to get some scientific backed certainty that you're reducing risk. You're going to see less harm produced, and you're going to be adding value to your clients because it's going to be a benefit to them. In the longer run, obviously, if we can get this right, it can have a big impact on your loss ratio by driving your costs down. It could give you that confidence to price differently, perhaps to take on some risks that aren't doing very well and work with them to improve their risk profile. And it's going to help with retention and reputation. So hopefully what you've got from this is that slips are serious and it affects the clients and it affects you guys, but there is a science to it and that they are stoppable. Here again are some examples. I'm happy to talk through any of these, but Euston train station, for example, documented case study, took a more scientific approach and saw a 60% reduction. Now, one of these does say elimination. That was about 2.5 years of elimination of accidents. I never would promise that. But the point to take is that, it is possible to dramatically reduce the volume and value of these claims. And for you guys, even if you could reduce by 1% or 3%, that would have a significant financial impact. Next steps, we're going to send out, I think, the replay and some links. But if you're on LinkedIn, do connect. And if you would like to have a chat about how we could, I could support you to implement some of these ideas, then send me a DM. So summing up, and then we'll go into questions. What I'm known for is trying to bring a fresh and a scientific approach to this age-old problem, this nagging, annoying, attritional problem that people think can't be solved, but it absolutely can. And so hopefully what you would feel after listening to this is that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and it is possible to do something about this and have confidence and certainty that this risk can be managed. So that's it from me. I have run pretty much the time, but yeah, very happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Christian. I think I'll speak on behalf of everyone on saying that was a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure people have plenty of questions. So if anyone does have a question they'd like to raise, please feel free to use the Q&A facility. I do have one question just to start us off, and that question is, where have you used some of these different suggestions that you've made during the presentation with a specific client, and how has that helped them statistically?
Yep. So I mean, obviously Euston Station was one good example. I've got a good example. I can't say who it is, but it's a national. Lots of these are in the book, but a national health club chain. So with about 100 odd leisure centres with swimming pools and all that sort of stuff, and they were having about 30% of their claims volumes were from slips, and that equated to about one a week. And within about a year, we had worked with them and supported them implementing some of these ideas, and that had reduced down to 8% of their claims by volume, and they were getting about one per month. So I can't remember what that is now, but it's about a 70%, I think, reduction. But what was interesting with that was the sort of additional benefits they got. So if you think about it, if you ever go to the gym or go swimming, if you've got young kids, you take them to swimming lessons, the changing rooms, the swimming pool, often they're a bit grubby and grotty and not very appealing. By focusing in on sort of improving their cleaning of their floors, for example, it uplifted the standards, and they actually saw a massive uptick in net promoter score, member feedback, member retention, and all sorts of other things. So they made more profit by mitigating the risk, but they also made more profit by the sort of additional benefits of selling more and retaining more business as well. So that would be one example from a customer. In terms of insurers, so we work, for example, with AXA XL. AXA XL have a proposition that they call Casualty Risk Assist, whereby they've partnered up with 4 providers that do sort of different services around risk mitigation. So we're one of their 4 on that panel, and we've worked with some really interesting businesses there and managed to kind of give them a much better insight for where they currently stand, and kind of part of that would be to give like a pilot scheme to show them, right, if we do some of this stuff, what are some of the outcomes? So yeah, there's quite a few examples.
That's really interesting, especially the point on leisure centres, because when you mentioned surfaces that are often going to be wet, that was my first thought. I thought, a swimming pool. So it's interesting to see how some of the initiatives you've come up with have helped improve safety in those areas. Another question we have, because you had mentioned very briefly at the beginning other jurisdictions and how the amount of claims that come through and how successful they are can vary. I don't know if you could speak a little bit to what the situation is like maybe in the US or some other jurisdictions, how often they do see slip and trip claims.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pretty much across the world, or if we say across the world, I mean the sort of the Western world, let's say, the accident data is pretty similar. So more or less, figure out the rate in the UK, divide it by the population, and then multiply that number by whatever the population is around the world, and you're going to get the rough idea of the accident rate. It's quite similar across the world from that perspective. Obviously, where things differ are, and it's more relevant for you guys, is what happens in terms of compensation claims. And so, if you think of somewhere like the Republic of Ireland or the US, there's a lot more. The legal frameworks and systems are more claimant friendly. In the US, you have certain states have I can't think of the terminology now, but it's basically if you're an employee and you make a claim, it's guaranteed you're going to get paid out. So there's no defense or anything like that. So that drives up costs and premiums. It's not the same in all states. In Ireland, a claim that might cost 14K in the UK might cost you double that in Ireland because it's just a bit more of a friendly system to claimants. So what I would say there is, we need to get on this preventative bandwagon more and more because, again, if we can stop the incident from happening, then there's no claim. If we just kind of allow the incidents to keep happening, the claims will keep coming through. But every so often there's going to be a big one, and it's the big ones that obviously really do hit hard. In the US, every state it becomes slightly more complicated because when we start to think about, for example, the science of slip testing, the states seem to have different views on what to use and what not to use. But the principles, and this is why I mostly speak about principles, the principles of those 5 C's that I shared, the 5 steps of the Slipology model, the 6 chimes, all of those principles apply wherever you are, whether you're in a swimming pool in America or you're a delivery driver in Kazakhstan even, they'd still apply. So it's just about, taking the trouble, the time and effort to kind of look at this in a bit more depth, because you hopefully now know that you can do something about it and we don't have to just accept that it's inevitable.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question we've had is, what would you hope for in 10 years' time that the slip safety arena would look like? What sort of improvements will you hope?
That's a great question. So I often speak about my kind of origin story, which you heard. Why am I involved in safety, and why did I end up in this world of slips? And I speak a lot about my mission, which is kind of what am I doing to try and change this. But the key thing is, what's the vision? And that's this question. So I love this question. So my vision is twofold. I believe that if we're more proactive and preventative and more scientific in this area, we can see at least 500,000 reduction in incidents across the globe. So that's where I think we can get to, and I think that would be achievable in the next 10 years. And I also think that, and I want to see a world in which safety is prioritized and people believe that you can profit from safety rather than safety being a pain in the bum. So that's kind of my vision. And then I suppose my mission is, by writing the book and doing things like this, is to try and facilitate that through education, but also some of the stuff that we can do practically to help. I can't stop 500,000 slips myself, but I can hopefully be a conduit for that change to happen over the next decade.
I think that is the perfect way to end the session, unless we have any final questions. But thank you so much, Christian, for your time today. I really enjoyed the presentation. I think especially those last few responses on questions have been really useful. I know you've agreed to us recording the session and sharing that and the slides after. So to everyone that's attended, please keep an eye out on your emails for those additional resources. And I hope you've all found the session very beneficial. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.